Hello again, everyone. This week we are reading Chapter 5 and 6 within Module 4. This is all about examining the gap that occurs between your firm and the customer, usually due to failure to really appreciate what the customer wants. Let's take a look at this in more detail as we understand customer requirements. Customer requirements usually involves a gap. Gap 1, the listening gap. How does this gap unfold in service delivery? Well, customers have an expectation of service, but the company has a perception of what the customer expects, and that perception is different from reality in many cases. When it is, there's a listening gap. And that's what we want to try and address by paying more close attention to what the client actually needs. What are factors that lead to this gap? Well, maybe we don't do our homework and we're not doing sufficient research. Maybe management doesn't understand what's going on at the level of the organization that actually interacts with the customer. Maybe we don't have a good enough relationship with the customer, and when things go wrong, we don't recover sufficiently. All of these things can lead to gaps. So we need to use research to better understand what customers need. And let's take a look at that. What are some objectives for research? Well, what we want to do is understand what customers want, what's their requirements or expectation. We could also use it to make sure that our service offerings are on target with what we intended. We may want to understand what customers are dissatisfied with our service so that we can do what we can to recover. Maybe determine customer expectations for a new service we may plan to offer. So there's a number of different objectives for research. All of them relate to trying to understand the customer better. Now, one thing to think about when you're doing research is that it's not an exclusive quantitative versus qualitative exercise. Qualitative is listening to customers, maybe observing what they do, maybe interviewing customers. Quantitative involves survey instruments. But in this type of research, you want some of both to get a more holistic view of what's going on. Maybe talk to the customer, observe their patterns, maybe do surveys, maybe do some statistical analysis of data associated with their buying patterns. But when you do the quantitative portion, you have to make sure you're using statistically valid survey instruments. Or to put it in layman's terms, you need to make sure that your survey instrument measures what you say it's going to measure. It has to measure what it's intended to measure. You have the same expectations out of a yardstick or ruler. Notice that research doesn't involve just surveys. Some research can occur without you even wanting it. For example, customer complaints. Customer complaints can be painful, but when they happen, they're an important source of data about customer expectations. You can also follow up after transactions or particular incidents with a customer, do some analysis of that transaction or incident. That's known as a critical incident study. Also, remember the 5 SERVQUAL attributes. You can use surveys that link to the 5 attributes and see where you are sitting with respect to customer expectations for each of those attributes. How would you get your questions answered? You may directly ask customers, maybe face-to-face, call them up, maybe one-on-one. Observe what customers do and observe in a very structured way. This is what's meant by anthropological tools. Taking detailed notes about what customers do when they're partaking of your service. Try to have an in-depth understanding of how they behave when they're using your service. Maybe get information from employees on the front line to understand better what's going on. Here's a summary of all the key attributes to an effective research program. Soliciting complaints, critical incident studies, relationship surveys, post-transaction surveys, social media. Social media is becoming a big one. If you do something wrong with a customer, the next thing you know, it might be trending on some social media site and your company could be in trouble. Market-oriented ethnography. This is akin to using anthropological tools. You're studying people in their natural habitats as they are partaking of your service. Mystery shopping, having someone go in and buy a service or buy a product and experience your customer service and then report on it. So there's a lot of different things you can do, and this is considered listening to the customer. It's active listening. You're reaching out for more information in order to minimize that gap. Here's a question you may ask a customer after a critical incident, or to try and get them to remember a particular critical incident. Think of a time when, as a customer, you had a particularly satisfying or dissatisfying interaction with an employee of, and then the name of the firm. When did it happen? What circumstances led to the situation? This is a means to get an in-depth understanding of what went wrong and why. Now remember the SERVQUAL attributes: reliability, responsiveness, assurance, empathy, intangibles. So if you had a survey geared around SERVQUAL attributes, here's what you can do with it. Here's a retail chain who use survey instruments. And remember, customers have a zone of tolerance, as we discussed last time in last week's readings. So what you see here is a survey instrument geared around the 5 SERVQUAL attributes as mapped against the zone of tolerance for each of those attributes. So for example, in reliability, this firm came under the minimum acceptable level of tolerance. Tangibles, they scored pretty well, and assurance and empathy, they're getting close. Remember, the top level of the zone of tolerance, you're delighting your customer. At the bottom level, you're giving them the minimum level of service. So this is a good way to survey against the 5 SERVQUAL attributes, and at the same time layer on top of that the zone of tolerance to see, are you in the zone or not. And you could look at attribute importance versus performance. So the more important the attribute, the higher your performance needs to be. So you need to maintain high if possible. So this is another way to view the results. And it's all part of listening. It doesn't seem like listening, it seems like research, but research is active listening. You're reaching out to glean as much information as you can from your client. Okay, but using the research, you want to make as much use as you can from the data you've gathered. Upward communications, maybe executive visits to customers. Here's an example. I usually go to Kroger for shopping, maybe Kroger or Publix. But the last time I went to Kroger, I noticed the Kroger manager walking around asking customers if they need any assistance, how are they doing, is there anything they can do for them. I've never seen the manager before. So I'm wondering, why am I seeing the manager walking around talking to people? Well, here's an important clue. Walmart just moved into the community with a brand new Walmart Supercenter. I expect that's probably created a giant sucking sound, and everyone's going to Walmart for the lowest prices. If you can't necessarily compete on those prices, what you can do is improve your service, and so the manager is walking around getting some of that upward communication in order to improve the gap 1, so you can stay in business when a nice new Walmart is just down the street. And Cabela's is the example given in the text where upward communication is provided. So that's an overview of listening to the customer. In Chapter 6, we'll take a look at customer relationships, which is an important aspect of listening to the customer. If you have that relationship established, it's far easier to understand what customers need and listen to what they want. So this has been Chapter 5, Reducing Gap 1 by listening to the customer. And remember, it's active listening where you're doing a lot of research to try and glean everything the client is trying to say, either explicitly or implicitly.